Jeff grew up in Cape Town, studied at UCT, went on to part of a formidable honours class, as I recall, at UCT, where a number, 3 or 4 of you, went on to be high-level professors around the world. 5 of you, there we are, sorry, okay, short-changing. Every now and again in universities there's a kind of, suddenly people end up in the same year and go on to do amazing things. And that was one of those years. Jeff then went on to do. He played for the Springbok rugby team. I do remember hearing as well. Okay. I must just explain that. That was when he taught briefly at Springbok in the Northern Cape.
Springbok teen Barbie, Springbok teen Gullies.
Okay, but it works anyway. And then went on to study postgraduate work at Madison in the United States. If I remember correctly, in the African Studies department, which was started by A.C. Jordan, this famous South African academic. And then, as you know, Jeff published the House of Phalo in the early 1980s, which was the first substantial Xhosa history of the Xhosa. Okay, there had been previous works, George Thiel, Marjorie Thiel, J.H. Soga, but Jeff had access to a range of materials which no one had used before. And I think the House of Phalo still stands as the basis from which other people have added, have contributed, has criticized. And Jeff today, as you hear from the advert, is busy reviewing and updating that magnificent work. Jeff also has published numerous articles. There was also The Dead Shall Arise, which he spoke about here in 1989, which is on the YouTube channel. Okay. Jeff has not only been an academic, though, he has used his historical knowledge and his insights for the betterment of society as well. So from being head of the history department at UNITRA in the 1980s, Jeff was pulled into Parliament as an ANC representative in the first Parliament, and from then went into the administration of the Eastern Cape government in the Department of Economic Affairs, and again used his historical knowledge around the terrible conflict, civil conflict that was taking place in the Solo and Kumbu area in those days, and making the headlines regularly. And you haven't seen any headlines for a long time, so historical knowledge is useful, is important. Jeff, over to you. Okay.
Thank you, Mike. Your check is in the post. Thank you. Thank you all for coming. One of the things that I've always believed in is that if history remains the property of the universities, it will go the way of Latin and Old English. History is not for specialists. History is for the people, for the community, because it has made us what we are, good and bad. So without regional historical societies such as yours, the only other one that I know of, Rebecca, Port Elizabeth is struggling. Makhanda, Grahamstown, it's trying to be reborn. Lower Albany, Port Alfred is still going strong. And it's such a pleasure for me to be here. So thank you all very much. I feel that by coming here, I'm helping to repay a debt, and to the people. Let me also, by way of my topic, this is not a talk about missionaries. The question of the missionary contribution is a major issue which is often discussed more by people who know very little about what happened. But what I'm actually going to be talking about is Christianity as expressed in the Bible, and how did it come to this country. And I've attended many lectures myself, and the habit that people get into is they look at the lecturer, they see how many papers he's got in front of, so they can sort of figure out when the damn thing is going to come to an end. And you're very brave to come to a lecture by a professor. Professors are pre-programmed to speak for 45 minutes without a stop. And if you ask any questions, it's because you didn't understand. So let me just quickly sketch. My lecture is built around 4 outstanding personalities, 3 of whom, as members of the Historical Society, should be familiar names. That is Dr. van der Kemp, Makhanda, also known as Glasgow, the left-handed person, Ntsikana, the Christian prophet, and then the surprise gift is Joseph Williams. If you know Buffalo, now Kwamakroma, and you just carry on along the road to Komani, Queenstown, about 8 kilometers up the road, you'll see a sign saying the Reverend William's grave, as if his first name was William. It's actually Williams. And he's also a major figure in my story. And there's also a surprise guest that you probably will not have heard of. So let me get going. I think probably most people in this room will know something about Dr. J.T. van der Kemp, a major figure in our history. And if you don't know the biography of Dr. van der Kemp was a military officer who led, we are told, a wild life, drinking, womanizing, and other things that don't bear thinking about. And one day he took his wife and his little daughter, this was in Holland, he took his wife and little daughter on a boat ride in the river, and the boat overturned, and his wife and his only child were drowned. And he took this, van der Kemp, as a revelation. And he joined the London Missionary Society. The London Missionary Society, it was not denominational. Anybody of any branch of the Protestant calling was able to join. And he joined the London Missionary Society, and he went, if you know where Dimbaza is, just opposite the other side of the tar road from Dimbaza is what is now Piri Mission. And that is where van der Kemp taught. And he only lasted about 15 months. But he left an impression that is still alive, because his Xhosa name was Nyengane. Now what that means, some people think it refers to his bald head, but it does not. Nyengane means to give secretly. In other words, van der Kemp is seen by the Xhosa clerics of old times as a secret giver, someone who ran away from his own people to share this precious secret of the Bible with everybody. And we are very fortunate that we have, from a descendant of one of his converts. I don't know if you know that story about the troopship Mendi. The troopship went down, and the chaplain with it. He went down praying, and his real name was Klitashe, but he goes by an English name or Scottish name, Washel. And he has left this account, which he got from his great-grandmother, of how Van der Kemp preached. So I'm just going to read this. The preaching of Van der Kemp was of a conversational character. There were several trees, and the men sat under one tree, while the women occupied the shade of another. All smoked their pipes while the preaching was going on. Sometimes there was some honey beer. What was known as, I won't say this word, Jabulani, was not known then. Van der Kemp told them there was a God in heaven. He created all things, the sun, the moon, the stars. There was one, the Sifuba Sibanzi, the broad-breasted one. He was the leader of men, was heralded by a star. His feet were wounded for us. His hands were pierced for us. His blood was shed for us. And after 15 months, due to internal politicking, both between the Khabe King Nika and his uncle Ndlambe, but also between the Dutch speakers and the British occupiers, and he was forced to leave. But from that beginning, the Christian religion, or more generally, the Bible, because Van der Kemp believed, it's not that he was not aware of the dogma, if I can put it like that, but he thought that if you know the Bible, that is all you need to know. And that is why he concentrated on these few points. In any case, due to the political machinations of that time, he went to Graafrenet, and from Graafrenet, he went to Bethelsdorp. And that was before the Fourth Frontier War. The Fourth Frontier War is the one after which Grahamstown was established. So during those few years, there were Xhosas, there were Dutch people, very few English people, and the Xhosa, certain Xhosa people used to go. There was no Port Elizabeth, by the way. There was just Bethelsdorp. And Xhosa chiefs, especially a certain chief Chachu. Chachu is the chief of just outside King Williamstown. You will find Chachu location, Amantinde. If you've never heard of Amantinde, think of Makhanda. He comes from that particular chieftain. And fast forward now from the time of Van der Kemp, that was about 1810. Think about this area between today Bereka, today Makhanda, Port Elizabeth, and Grahamstown. And people were visiting Van der Kemp, hearing the story. And among them was a young man whose mother had been abandoned by his biological father. And his name was Mele. Excuse my pronunciation, which means left-handed. So left-handed in Dutch is links. So they call him, the English called him lynx, like in the wild animal. And when the poet Thomas Pringle arrived, he said, well, you can't say mele in poetry. It won't rhyme. And you can't even say Makhanda in English poetry. So he cut out the D. So they wrote a poem called Makana's Uprising. And that's why you have got that confusion, that his birth name was Mele, and then his throne name was Makhanda, which was shortened by Thomas Pringle to Makhana. And we have a record of a meeting which he held, Makhanda, in somewhere not very far from Alice. And it was attended by a certain Reverend Reed, James Reed, who had been a younger companion of Van der Kemp and was regarded by Xhosa People as the Ninawa, that is, as the younger brother of Van der Kemp. And we are fortunate to actually know what Makhanda, I'm going to stay with that name, we're fortunate to know what was Makhanda saying in 1816, because it was very different to what he was saying 2 years later. So we're very fortunate to have this insight into Makhanda's revelation. I'll just read it to you. Makhanda, who was present, addressed the gathering. He began with the stories of creation and the fall, and proceeded to the flood, which he said was proved by the presence of seashells on some of the highest mountains. He upbraided the people for their blindness and hardness of heart. They drank water, but never thought about the water of life. They walked through the thorn bushes without reflecting that Tai, Makhanda's name for Jesus Christ, was crowned with thorns. God would come again in judgment, but this time with fire, not with water. God had sent them Ntsikana, that is Van der Kemp, to warn them, but they had not listened to him, and so he, Van der Kemp, had left them. He also said that God had made woman out of Adam's rib, and if one woman was good enough for Adam, it was good enough for anybody. He told everybody that he would not speak to anybody carrying a spear. If they wanted to hear the truth from him, they should leave their spears at home or throw them away or anything like that. I can ask you, is there anything there that is really in conflict with the teaching of the Bible? And yet this is the very man who 3 years later, as I can use the word, as a witch doctor, attacked Grahamstown with fire and the sword. Now, where did Makhanda get these ideas from? He did know Van der Kemp, but when he was captured on Robben Island, he spoke to a visiting missionary, and he said, "Now I know Van der Kemp." He must have picked this up, this knowledge of the Bible. He must have picked it up somewhere from Van der Kemp. But, Van der Kemp never said that the dead will arise. He concentrated on those parts of the Bible that I've already read to you. And what I've discovered is that the traditional, I've lost it of course, I'm a professor after all, I'm entitled to lose things. This is from the standard interpretation of the life of Makhanda. He was enlightened by his visits to Grahamstown specifically, where British government has just established a military headquarters. And this is what a contemporary says. He was frequently in the habit of visiting the British headquarters in Grahamstown and had evinced an insatiable curiosity and an acute judgment on subjects both speculative and practical. With the military officers he talked of war or such of mechanical arts as fell under his observation. But his great delight, this is the important bit, wake up everybody, his great delight was to converse with Mr. van der Lingen, the chaplain, to elicit information in regard to the doctrines of Christianity. and to puzzle him, the chaplain, in return with metaphysical subtleties and mystical ravings. Now, one of the things I found out, for those of you who can read Afrikaans, there is a wonderful novel by Xhosa People, the lady who wrote the book about Courtenay-Latimer, called Missionaries. There's a very bad English translation, and you have to read it in Afrikaans. And that reveals that Van der Linden had experience in Cape Town. There was a big earthquake around 1808, where people thought the world was coming to an end. So some of these, we can call them millenarian ideas, were actually not Makhanda's, but he had picked them up from a Dutch chaplain. In any case, so everybody was there, but not everybody was there. In those days, Xhosa Kingdom, or Xhosa Kingdom, was divided between the younger chief Ntsikana and his uncle Makhanda. And Ntsikana lived in the mountains, near the Hogsback, the Makhanda River. Whereas Ndlambe, and Port Alfred these days is Ndlambe, had lived along the coast. So the people who knew Van der Kemp, the people who knew Nele Makhanda, were all followers of Ndlambe, who, having been expelled from what is today Albany District by the British, was opposed to the Ndlambe, and then were opposed to the British. Whereas Ntsikana, living in what is today Buffalo, KwaMakroma, Fort Beaufort, had not yet been affected by the British invasion. So what was not known to the missionaries was that Makhanda, Mele, and Chachu were actually of Ndlambe's faction. And Ntsikana, who was pro-British, was hated by Ndlambe's faction. So they said, after Makhanda made that speech, and of course the missionaries present, including Reverend Reed, had welcomed the speech, even to the extent of giving up some of their important customs, such as polygamy, for example, throwing away the spears. They were going to do that at Makhanda's bidding. And they said to the Reverend Williams, you see, the Reverend Williams had come over from England as the first missionary after Van der Kemp. They said to the Reverend Williams, we welcome you. We want you to come and stay with us and teach us everything. But unfortunately, the British government was on the side of the other Xhosa faction, the faction of King Ntsikana. And they knew that Lord Charles Somerset would never agree to the missionary, because they didn't trust missionaries because they couldn't control them. So they said, no, well, thanks for inviting us around, but we need to speak to the king, who is Ntsikana. And of course, Ndlambe had spent his whole life fighting against Ntsikana. He said to the missionaries, no. If you can't come here, we understand it. But then please go back to the colony, and we will come and visit you on the, as it were, the colonial side. But please don't go back. Don't establish your mission with our enemies. And that was simply not on the books. So when the missionary chose the spot where they built the mission station, it was in Ntsikana's territory. Ntsikana was staying near where Burns Hill, on the Alice Road. Ntsikana was staying there. So it was convenient. It was also convenient to the British military post at Cook House. And the Lord Charles Somerset was only interested in the mission in as much as it could be of use to the British government. And this was basically where I said my talk should be called The Road Not Taken. This was the great missed opportunity in the history of religion in this country. Because there was an important faction that wanted the teachings of Van der Kemp, which, as we know, were the teachings of the Bible, like in that extract, that was wanted. And when the mission, by the way, if you know that road that goes from toward Beaufort, that was, towards Simon, there's a sign saying the Reverend William's grave. This man, the Reverend Williams, one of the tragic heroes. He was from the east end of London. He was a carpenter. He was called by Lord Charles Somerset and the magistrate Kyler, ignorant and cowardly. That's because as far as he was concerned, this was not his business. Politics was not his business. And yet he was, as it were, compelled to preach to the very chief. In fact, Lincoln was not against Christianity. He was just the sort of political leader, we know them well, that liked to hedge his bets and liked to be on the winning side. But when the Reverend Williams, speaking in the words of which coming from Van der Kemp had been acceptable, he just wouldn't do it, He was too concerned with being popular with his own people. And I think I really want to end this talk here because I would like to give people an opportunity to ask questions. I have not talked about the prophet Ntsikana. I should just say that Ntsikana, again, if you go past the Reverend Williams' grave, you will come to the Badderford's food store, and then just a little bit further on you get to a place that is called in English or Dutch Blinkwater. That is where Ntsikana was. And he came there. It is not known that he ever met Van der Kemp. What is known about Ntsikana is that he had a revelation. It is said that he went to... I said I wasn't going to talk about him, now I'm talking about him. Sorry about that. Ntsikana went to a dance. And, a sort of, how can I put it, a traditional dance, not a Christian dance, obviously. And as soon as he got up to dance, a whirlwind sprang up. Then when he sat down, the wind stopped. It's got so bad that people said, Ntsikana, you better leave. We want to carry on with our dance. So he left, and before he got home, he had to cross a small river, what they call in House of Phalo. And a voice came to him and said, go into this river and wash off, because in those days, of course, the people didn't wear European clothes. If they were wanting to look smart, like to go to a dance, they used to rub themselves with red ochre, Ebola, right? And this voice said to him, go into that river and wash this rubbish off you. And after that, he became inspired, and he wrote a wonderful hymn, which is still sung even today. Now, I won't sing it, I can recite it. When Makhanda started to preach, he said, no, this is not right. Ntsikana actually gave an ox to Makhanda as a sign of his belief. But when Makhanda started to say that the dead will arise, Ntsikana said, no, that's not going to happen. And he broke away in favor of his own revelation. And because his land was situated in Mika's land, he then adhered to the cause of Mika. So I think it's really very, I mean, the consequences, frankly, are still with us. If, I'm not trying to blame Lord Charles Somerset, but actually I am. If the Bible had been allowed to make its own way, I think the history of this country would have been very different. Let me just end there. Thank you for listening so nicely.
Are there any questions for Professor?
Do you have time to talk about Xhosa?
Xhosa was, in the way history is taught these days, there's a phrase called emergent intellectuals. They talk about emergent intellectuals, people like Xhosa and J.T. Jabavu and so on. But since there has been this question, Ntsikana, no, I'm answering you now.
Thank you.
Ntsikana had, before he passed away, he had composed his great hymn, and he had also composed a sort of a chant, which is called Ntsikana's Bell, to call people to prayer. And a very small group of people were converted by Ntsikana. And one of them was he's known in the literature as Old Soga. And then another famous family from that time is the Balfour family. I mean, that's why they have the surname of Balfour. And Old Soga had several sons, and the oldest son stayed behind. If you want to find their descendants, they're in Ntsikana, in the Transkei. And Tio was sent off to Scotland for his education. So Xhosa was the first black person who was officially ordained by the Church of Scotland. You see, in those days, if you wanted to become a minister, it wasn't enough to know the Bible, you had to speak Hebrew and Greek as well. It was such a bar. You could be a believer, but you could not be recognized as umfundisi, a teacher. You would only be what they call umshumayeli, a preacher. That was the most that you could do. Now, I used to lecture African history, by the way. You see, I'm not suggesting that anybody here should convert to Islam. But in order to become accepted as a Muslim, there's only one requirement. That you should be able to say, in all sincerity, there is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet. And if you've ever said that with your whole heart, you are accepted as a Muslim. But with the way that Christianity was taught, not by Van der Kemp, not by Ntsikana, you had to know so much before you were even admitted into the congregation. Now, whether that was right or whether that was wrong, that's another lecture. which I wouldn't like to give. But it was just, I think the thing about Van der Kemp, when the young Chachu first saw Van der Kemp in Bethelsdorp, you know, he said, I remember the first time I saw Van der Kemp, he wasn't wearing a hat, he wasn't even wearing shoes, he was just wandering around in a sort of a dwal. But the thing is, he believed, you see. So the whole question of belief was central to the teachings of Van der Kemp and Ntsikana. Joseph Williams, unfortunately, we don't know, because it's a very sad story. He had a tragic life. He died at the age of 38 with the people who came up from Bethelsdorp to support him all ran away when they saw that his teaching wasn't popular. Even the little Chachu ran away. But to get back to Tio Soga wrote hymns. He is also, I said that his Ntsikana wrote a great hymn. The other hymn that he still sung is called Lizalis Idingalako. Fulfill your promise. Tio Soga had, I was reading, and you know, Xhosa people have got praise names, and those praise names have got meanings. So when I came across the praise name of Tio Soga, I can't quite remember it, but in English it's dirty knees. So I thought, what is this? Here we have a man, who's educated with a degree in Scotland. He's got a Scottish wife. He's completely assimilated in his private and personal life with the Presbyterian Church and the European way of doing things. And yet they praise him not for his learning or his religion. They praise him as dirty knees. And so, this sort of bothered me. And eventually I asked someone who told me that the reason they call him dirty knees is because he was always praying to God, getting down on his knees to God. So, as I said, he unfortunately, Scotland's very cold. And while he was there, he caught pneumonia, he caught TB in Scotland. So he died at the age of 42, having written some of not only this famous hymn, but all the historical articles. In that, I've always been an optimist, triumph of hope over experience. If you're really serious about this, this is a wonderful book. A lot of what this book had not come out when I wrote House of Phalo. That was 41 years ago, by the way. And I'm not yet 82. Getting there, but I'm not yet 82. So that is why I'm updating my book. Not because it's wrong. Just a few mistakes here and there. You don't want to know. But once one was able to read, I've got is it Xhosa on the one side and English on the facing page, so it's available to anybody. And as I said, I've got the details on that handout. So now I've also forgotten where I was. Yeah. It's I don't know William, whether people got that handout.
Yes, I did have the whole of the copies.
Yeah. No. It's that one. I mean, there are others as well. But don't read the English translation of Missionaries. No. It's not that the translation is bad. It's that the translation actually changed the words. It's actually changed the text. So, yeah.
sure it's as relevant as it was when I was going to ask it, but the way you described it, you covered some geography, the Makhanda area, and then up towards Hogsback. In those days where there weren't the communication channels that we have these days. So it sounded like there were different people teaching the Bible way back from the 1800s upwards. When you study your history, do you see that in these places where the teachings were from different influential people, that there were different branches or very different interpretations of the biblical messages? Is there anything in that?
Yes, thanks very much. Again, this is why I stopped in 1820. I think it was about 1820 that maybe if I could just go back a little bit into the history of the missions. As I said, the very first missionary societies, or the missionary call, let me say, it was a sort of an outcome of the sort of moral movements in Europe that started with the movement to abolish the slave trade. So that the mission calling you must preach everywhere. Gospel must be preached everywhere. It was a sort of accompanying the anti-slavery movement. And therefore it was not a movement originally that was organized by any church. That's why you had the London Missionary Society, which Van Kemp joined, simply because these were not denominational. The old London Missionary Society, the mission stations eventually became the Congregational Church. But it was not the Congregational Church at that time. Then in about, I think it was 1819 or 1820, there was a big debate in Glasgow about whether the Presbyterian Church should join the missionary movement. And there was this debate apparently, I wasn't there by the way, in 1820. The debate raised because there were people attending the Presbyterian Assembly that said, how can you go to Africa and teach the Bible, to people that don't know us and we don't know them? Are there no heathens in the slums of Glasgow? Should we not be giving all of our attention, spending all our money on our own people, rather than going and preaching the gospel all over the world? And that actually won the argument. But the minority then formed themselves into the Glasgow Missionary Society. And I think it probably had something to do with the fact that the king was, Klinker, was also in that general close to what is Alice. They then went to what later became Alice and set up Lovedale Mission. And that was happening in the mountains. Then in 1820, as I hope everybody knows that, came the 1820 settlers. And among the 1820 settlers was the Reverend William Shaw. And William Shaw, Methodist, had a completely different theory of missionizing to the Presbyterians, or the Glasgow missionaries, I should say. What the Glasgow missionaries tried to do was to concentrate on a small area and sort of carpet bomb it with missions. So there were so many mission stations in that small area around Lovedale, which is now Alice, Burns Hill, Pirrie, and others. So they missionized a small part of the Eastern Cape, basically in the Amatole Mountains. Now, William Shaw, the Methodist, had a completely different strategy. He said, look, we have got Methodists here in Grahamstown. We have got other Methodists way up there in Port Natal. Why don't we establish a chain of mission stations at a convenient wagon distance from each other? So that is why, instead of having all the missions close together, the Methodist strategy was to have a mission within one wagon distance from the other. So, and then they later closed the gaps. So you had Grahamstown, which of course was not in Xhosaland at that time. It started there, from there it went to Peddy, from there it went to Mount Coke, from there it went to Butterworth, from there it went to Clarkbury in Tembuland, all the way up to Durban. And of course, it was precisely where the Glasgow Missionaries has put up their mission station that all the frontier wars were fought. So no sooner had they put up a mission station than the war came and burnt the whole place down. Whereas with the Methodists, their strategy, I'm sure it was not intentional, but they basically seized the majority of the Eastern Cape. The Anglican Church came much later. The Anglican Church came in the 1850s with, in the time of Governor George Grey. So they had St. Luke's, which we today call Newlands. Yeah, sorry, I wasn't expecting this question. In fact, you didn't ask. St. Luke's, St. Matthew's, which is now in Christkammerhoek. St. Mark's, which is near Koffibaba, 20 kilometers from Koffibaba. And then you had St. John's, which somehow didn't survive. So the Catholic Church came even later, and they sort of entered into places that weren't already taken. Yeah, they try not to compete with each other. I don't know whether that answers the question.
No, thanks, that's very interesting.
Jeff, can I ask, the period you were talking about, around about the 1820s, the early introduction of Christianity, how much did that spread of Christianity at that time depend on working through the traditional leaders like Mhlanga, or working directly to the people themselves? We get told these days that everything in the rural areas must be done through the traditional leadership. And it seems to me that the conventional story of the missions, the early mission stations, the only cause of people who were there were outcasts and skillums and so on. They weren't the main population. They weren't the main people of the area. But surely the influence of the chiefs at that stage was very strong. You were saying, that obviously the geographical division and the chiefly division between Mhlanga and Kemp. How much did the spread of that early Christianity depend on their attitude and their approval and support?
Can someone ask me an easier question? No, it's an important question, so let me... The wonderful thing about history is nobody's right, nobody's wrong, because none of us were there at the time. So obviously, you can, as it were, spin the answer the way you want it. The way I understand this is the first missionary societies. I'm not now talking about the people that I started talking about. That is Van der Kemp, Reed, and Joseph Williams. I'm talking about the actual organized missionary societies, Glasgow, Wesleyan, Anglican, and so They were very much impressed with the history of the Roman Emperor Constantine in about the year 320 in what is now Istanbul. Because what happened there, for those of you that might not be that much up on Ottoman history, is that the Christian religion, although it was it had its adherents, but it only really became the majority religion of the Roman Empire when the Emperor Constantine adopted Christianity. And they had this sort of picture of that if they could just capture the king or the chief, then everything else would flow from that. But that theory kind of hit a block, because the impression one gets reading the original literature is they thought that when they first went into Xhosaland, that was the time that Makhanda was still in his Christian phase. They were accompanied by Chachu, the son of old Chachu, who was the chief of the Amantinde. And they sort of, first of all, he was not a very senior among the Machawe chiefs. The Ntinde chiefdom is not one of the great houses. But at this critical moment, and in fact there's a whole book that's been written about Chachu called, by an American professor. It's called A Living Man from Africa. And he doesn't pick this up. But unfortunately, when Joseph Williams was in deep trouble, because he'd been rejected, but he would have been welcomed on the Ndlambe side. But because he was sent to the other side, he was getting bad vibes from everybody. Even Jan Chachu's brothers, who came out to join him where he was, they got cold feet and they ran away, basically. There's only one sentence in the historical record that strongly suggests that Jan Chachu could not take the pressure that was being exerted on him by the other Xhosa. So basically, the missionaries, they had to get permission from the traditional leaders. Xhosaland, Tembuland, these were independent countries. You couldn't just go there without getting permission. But I think the chiefs and kings and so on, they did not accept the missionaries because they really wanted them. Some of them wanted them more than others. This is why there's a general perception, which for once I agree with, that the first chief, a Xhosa chief, that was a sincere convert to Christianity was Chief Kama, the Kama family who are in Middeldrift today, that he was the first genuine convert. And this is precisely why the story of Ntsikana is so absolutely basic to Xhosa religious belief. Because if they get accused by, how can I put it, antagonistic people to say, how can you accept a foreign religion here in Africa? You always hear that Christianity was not brought to Africa by foreigners. Christianity was revealed to Xhosa people by Ntsikana. And although you can actually prove, I think I can, prove that Makhanda was converted to Christianity by Kemp, there's no evidence at all that Ntsikana was converted by a foreigner. The only thing that we know about Ntsikana, if you know the road from Alice up to Hogsback, there's a turn off to Simo. Just down the road from there you get the Makhanda River. That is where Ntsikana was living when he had his revelation. And then after he had his revelations, only then that Reverend Williams established himself. And then he moved to Sihota, that is the place I talked about near Badford, because he understood you should not travel on the Sabbath. And they wanted to go to church. The believers, you see, people like old Sorga, they were converted by Ntsikana. So old Sorga, for example, the father of Teal, was actually killed by the British forces. They didn't see a contradiction at that time. But what actually happened, sorry, I'm digressing. There's a story about the Amamfengu. And of course, this was in former days, the days of former President, Ciskei President Sebe, a lot of tribalism, trying to stoke up one Xhosa group against another Xhosa group. And that is where the Xhosas on the one hand and the so-called Mfengu on the other hand are divided. There's a big ceremony, I don't know if people in the Historical Society are aware. There is a major event in Eastern Cape history that is called, and there's even a high school in Bulawayo named after this event, Kwashu. It's a particular tree. If you take the gravel road that goes from Pedi, Mushwa, up towards Alice, you sort of get into a kind of a barren plain. There are no trees, it's completely flat. And there, about 12, 15 kilometers from the town, you will see a lone tree in the middle of nowhere. Of course, it's now surrounded by memorial plaques that were put up for Heritage Day in September. That is where the Reverend John Aleph led 17,000 so-called Mfengu people. These were people who were refugees from Shaka Zulu, from the Tugela. And he made, or he led the chiefs of the Amamfengu to swear a great oath that you will, 1, accept Christianity, 2, educate your children, and 3, this is the controversial one, obey the government. And that was the backdrop to a lot of the things that happened. You see, at that time, Hinsa, King Hinsa, the one whose head was cut off, but before his head was cut off, he had accepted the Reverend Aleph to establish a mission station at Butterworth, now Agua. If you want to know where that is, go to the bus station in Butterworth, and you can see the old mission church of Reverend Aleph. And one day, Hinsa was very nervous. Hinsa was a great friend of Louis Trichardt. I don't know if you know about the origins of the Great Trek. You know why? You know Louis Trichardt was the first voortrekker? He was also a gun runner. If you go to Koffenbaba, there's a big dam there called Lubisi Dam. Lubisi is Louis. There's also a location just next door to Lubisi. It's called Seplan. Seplan is Sabrand. And there's another station there called Ntsikana. That is Isaac. So the first voortrekkers were allies of the first voortrekkers, together with Hinsa, to chase the British out of the country. So you can see how times have changed. But in any case, Hinsa was very suspicious of the British and English people in general. But he allowed Reverend Aleph, or Reverend Shrewsbury first, to establish a mission in his country. And then one day, he says, what are these people doing here? And he arrived unexpectedly, this is King Xhosa, to the mission station in Butterworth. And unfortunately, this was exactly the time that 5 or 6 Xhosa, that is Mfengu converts, had been baptized. And so they were kneeling in front of Aleph, and Aleph was sprinkling them with water. And then Xhosa thought that these strangers, Mfengu, are praying to Aleph, not to me. So you see, there were all of these. I know I'm not answering the question. There were all of these constraints. The idea that it was only outcasts and losers, battered wives, runaway girls, things like that, suspected witches. Yes, it's true that many of the first converts were people who, one way or another, were not welcomed in their own homes. And that is why the Ntsikana story is so important, because although there are not many, the 5 or 6 converts of Ntsikana, when Ntsikana died, he died at a place called Twatwa, which in English is Tambukisvlei. And even now there's a big issue in the Stockholm district about the tree under which Ntsikana preached. Because I can see some people here smiling. You can please some of the people all of the time. You see, Ntsikana was my clan, Ntsikana. And Ntsikana, in the old history, about 1500, was cooed by his brother Charlie. Today, all the chiefs of the Xhosas, I don't mean the Tembus, Pongo, those are different people, by the way. In Johannesburg, everybody from the Eastern Cape is a Xhosa. But in the Eastern Cape itself, they do differentiate between the 4 great kingdoms and other unrelated chiefdoms. So the Amakrika got together. They didn't have a candidate because they'd lost their kingship about 450 years ago. So they had the Ntsikana family. Then they said, there's that tree. That is the tree under which Ntsikana preached. And in this case, I think at some point there was nearly a violent confrontation over this matter, because the grave of Ntsikana is in Tambukisvlei. But people were only going a journey. He was on his way, so you could feel, Ntsikana could feel death approaching. And the Reverend John Brownlee, a few years later, he was the founder of what became King Williamstown. He was, when Ntsikana was literally dying, he told his disciples, they said, what must we do, teacher? Williams is dead, you are dying, what must we now do? And he said, go to Brownlee, who was at that stage in Chume River near Alice. So, I'm afraid I'm getting out of control now. But if there's one thing I can really say, to know the history of the Eastern Cape. If you love the Eastern Cape, you love the history, and if you love the history, you love the Eastern Cape. There is so much that has happened here, which I'm amazed that my wife hasn't divorced me and that my children haven't yet run away, because if I drive around, this is where this happens. But it makes the journey worthwhile.
There's one question here.
Thanks so much, Jeff, and I'm so glad to hear. I hope I read correctly. There will be and you've mentioned a revised edition. I just would like to know if you could comment a bit more about whether you've also used what's become a lot more accessible behind paywalls, unless you're a university student or lecturer, like Newsbank, African Newspaper Database, but some are open access with some like infos of Sundu, or whether you've seen any other sources beyond, say, some of the missionary or British colonial sources to inform the book. And then secondly, could you comment a little bit about the choice of the subtitle of the book? Is that going to remain, or are you rethinking it? It's, I think, a history of the Xhosa people in the days of their independence, which is quite a memorable one. But there's been a lot of work, even comparatively, in the world around sovereignty and indigenous peoples, not just within Southern Africa, it's First Nations in North America. And so it goes back to my first question about sources, whether you've maybe some thought on how the Xhosa peoples viewed their own sovereignty or their own positionality, whether any new insights come out of that.
You know, I vividly remember during the days of my extreme youth, when I was wandering around Ntsikana and Katiana districts. In those days, there were only 3 kinds of white people that went there: reverends, labor agents, and policemen. So since I was obviously not a reverend, not a labor agent, I must be a policeman. But fortunately, some people did trust me. And the question I was most asked in 1975, because in those days there was still work on the mines, is it true that Xhosa was a dog that ran away from Chaka? Because that's what the Zulus used to say to them, you see? What I found out, when I looked at it, there was no perception that there was such a thing as a Xhosa kingdom. Everybody knew that there was a very strong and mighty Zulu kingdom. Everybody would agree that there was a very wise ruler in Lesotho, Moshweshwe. But nobody could quote. There seemed to be a whole bunch of quarreling people. And, you know, it's not good to speak badly of one's predecessors. Somebody else might get into the habit. But there was a theory. I won't actually mention the name of the person, but he was a very influential person. He wrote one book called The Tribes of King Williamstown District, and another book called The Tribes of Willowvale District, and The Tribes of Mount Freer District, etc., etc. And he maintained that the Xhosa kingdom was not a kingdom, that it was a congeries of chiefdoms. In other words, that there was no unity at all, ignoring the fact that some of those divisions that had come about were, I mean, in some cases, certainly, some but not all cases, a question of colonial intervention. But nevertheless, the idea of kingship, there is a word, and for some time people were saying that this was a word that was brought by the missionaries, ikunkani. Yeah, you see, kunkani is Xhosa for king, as opposed to inkosi, which is the word for chief. And you can't actually ever mix those up. And it was precisely because, you know, I found it in 1828, before anybody else could have produced this. The other question is the question about what sources do we have for Xhosa history? Is it all what was written in newspapers, or is it all colonial documents? Again, this was very challenging to me when I was just starting my research. And what I found is there's a very rich source of oral history that is today even more important than it used to be. And that is what we call clan history. Now, every Xhosa person, as far as I know, every Xhosa-speaking person, even someone from Umzimkhulu on the Natal border, everybody has got a clan. A clan is like, if your name is, if you know that, I know that you and I are related, even though we can't trace our genealogy, and Xhosa people are very keen on genealogy, lineage, what they call umnombo. So if somebody shares your clan name, you know that they are related to you somewhere along the line, maybe even 500 years ago. If you and I share Isiduko, a clan name, we must be related, and therefore we cannot marry each other. Otherwise, it's an incest to marry anybody who's got your clan name. And each clan has got its praises. And some of those praises are just simply the names of the person's forefather. But others have got a deep historical significance. So, for example, a person of a certain clan, he might have the clan name of Mfene. Mfene is a baboon, right? Or he might call himself Shlati. Shlati is a forest. That's where the baboons live. And you know from that his great-great-great-grandfather was a Sotho. Because Sotho people have got these totems. So, for example, people with a clan name Mfene are of Sesotho origin, or Bafokeng in Sesotho. Again, if somebody has got the clan name of Sukwini, you know that person is of Khoisan origin, because Sukwini was an old Khoi chief. And then you can say, well, who was Sukwini, who was his father, and so on. And then you can trace that back to the Inkwa kingdom that was based in Graaff-Reinet. Then again, there's, I could go on and on. In fact, I am going on and on. Then there's another clan called Angosini. And then, that means that they praise each other as Abantu Bomlambo, people of the river. And that goes back to a certain incident where a chief named Prigozhin was drowned. On the coastal road where you cross the Fish River, on the maps, they call it Lower K-Drift, but that is Prigozhin's ford. So you see, and then questions around the names of mountains. So, for example, there's another debate in Xhosa history. Ntaba Kandoda, which means the mountain of man. But there are people who say that Ndoda was a San, that is a Twa, a Bushman chief. So you see, whether it's from place names, whether it's from clan names, you can get a lot, and the good thing about it is it takes you below. Some people feel, this history is only a history of chiefs and chieftainesses and royal people. How are you going to get at the history of the ordinary person who is not a chief? And so through these kinds of things you can get at it. Obviously not as much as you would like.
I think this is going to be the last question. Thank you.
Yes, I'm a direct descendant from Tambuki's clan. And you've spoken about Ntsikana's grave on our land. Now, Tambuki's clan has a history of restitution. Just a few years ago, our land rights were restored. And so the land was given back in trust to the original owners. Now, the grave of Ntsikana being on the land, it's become quite a contentious issue now, because Ntsikana's descendants have now come onto the land, unlawfully opened a graveyard, and they're now bringing all of their people to be buried in this newly established graveyard on Tambuki's land. What's your take on that?
I know this lady and her family and her home. That touches on the question. You see, that is exactly the issue where history becomes very, very highly relevant. Because as I was talking about Ntsikana, it is known that Ntsikana died at Twatwa, that is Tambuki's flay. And his grave was always respected by the Khoisan people of the Cat River. I mean, during the worst days of the old order, the people who lived around the grave always kept it up. Now, there has been this people who would like to, you cannot be recognized as a chief without having land. That's what the law says. In order to be recognized as a chief, you have to have a genealogy, you have to have people who support you, and you have to have a land. But because Klikha was couped around about 1500, they've got their people, they've got their following, they've got their genealogy, but they don't have land. And that is why they have zeroed in on this particular grave. But I'm just trying to say, there are so many stories, and each story is a story in itself, on its own. That's one reason. I think somebody asked me, when am I going to... House of Phalo was a great book, and one reason I say it was a great book was about 167 pages. It was 167 pages, and there was a hell of a lot of information on every page. Now, now when I'm revising, it's about 167 pages per chapter. So I need to kind of cut it down as well as updating it. As I said, our history is very deep. It's also very relevant. It's just very difficult to write one book covering the whole history. And especially when you go to the whole Eastern Cape, quite apart from the Khoisan descendants, and also the Sotho descendants who live around the Maluti Islands and the Tatia. You've got Xhosas, you've got Pondos, you've got Tembus, you've got Ponomises, you've got Bomvanas, you get Bathas, you get Krisifa. And each of them has got its own history. So it's really, I think that a really wonderful thing about our province, if you travel, you hear other people saying, hey, come from the Eastern Cape, why don't you move here? Is that in general, during the homeland era, especially here in the former Ciskei, there was a definite movement to stir up enmity between the Amamfengu and Chief Mabandla on the one hand, and the Amakrosa with Chief, so-called Chief Sebe on the other hand. And I think that now people who try to stir it up are quickly slapped down. Anyway, so I think that is a good thing about this province. The hostility between the different subgroups is nothing like it is in other places. Like Nigeria. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Call on Dr. Patrick Hutchison to express a word of thanks to you. Thank you.
Professor Peires, I think I can speak on behalf of all of us, this audience, that we feel very privileged to have you address our society this afternoon. We've come here not just to listen to you, but to see you in the flesh, because we've all read you.
Yes.
Then I want to just, that's speaking on behalf of us, I'd like to just say a few words on behalf of me. I was shocked. I knew I had to give this thanks this afternoon. So I went and reread your chapter 5 and looked at the book. I'm absolutely gobsmacked. And I would hate to differ with the professor, but my book says that the first impression of House of of Phalo was 1981. I'm gobsmacked that that's 45 years ago. In fact, I'm depressed by that fact. But mine I've got in 1989, so I'd forgotten everything I'd read there, and I had to just revise chapter 5. And you signed my book, autographed it in 1996. Thank you. But I would encourage all of you, if you can access that book, read chapter 5. It is absolutely fascinating. I'm sure when I first read it, I didn't comprehend half of what you said. One of the interesting things that you answered, whenever I go to Gompo and talk about it, I come unstuck when I ask myself, Lynx Makhanda was up there and he's promised he could jump over to there and all these people over there. How did he extricate himself from that predicament? And it's answered in your book. It's answered, I think, in the footnotes. And it's an interesting fact. Do you mind if I quote that? Is that he's told all the people, okay, now you must go and wash yourselves in the sea. And they all took off and washed themselves in the sea and couldn't resist singing a war cry. And he said, no, I didn't tell you to sing a war cry. Now you've ruined the whole plot. And that's how he got out of it, according to someone. I thought you might just like that. But thank you very much. We are privileged to have you. And can you give us an idea, when is your revised book coming out?
I wish I knew, and so is my publisher. Sorry, but you just reminded me of something. The thing is that as you get older, you spot all your own mistakes, and you just got to get a book out before someone else spots them. But I would like to think that the new chapter 5 eventually will not be a contradiction to the old chapter 5. And I also prepared for this, and I actually forgot, I've got a counter present. As one does when one is looking for a job, so that you can tell your father, who says that you should have done medicine, and then I had to get a job somewhere, and you need to publish or perish. So I did publish my old chapter 5, in a learned journal, and I found some old copies of it. There are about 8 copies, and this is actually a journal article, but it's basically the old chapter 5. The new chapter 5 will be much better. Don't hold your breath. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
By the way, I see some people that I used to know in one of my former lives, so I can't rush out. Anybody who wants to say hello, Jeff, as opposed to hello, Prof, I'd like to say.
Thank you. So there is tea and coffee if anyone would like in the foyer.